So today is day 4 of our 16 days of activism program here at the Parallel Lives Network, hosted by the Documentary Media Centre. And I'm catching up with a good friend of the Documentary Media Centre, our researcher in residence, no doubt. Bit difficult now, being as you've moved up to University of Glasgow, but kind of virtually in residence, kind of always here, haunting the halls like a ghost. Paul Reilly, how are you, Paul? You okay?
Hi, John. How's you?
Not too bad, not too bad now. But we're both COVID boosted and flu jabbed and stuff like that, and both feeling the effects of it. But I think that's more to do with our age than anything else. So we'll soldier on through. We'll soldier on through this conversation, shall we? But listen, it's great to catch up with you. Simply because you said this week as well, which is, I never realised until you mentioned it. It's actually 10 years since the flag protests that are actually mentioned in your book, the digital contention in a divided society. And of course, the interesting thing about the last time we spoke about this was the launch. I looked it up earlier. It was January the 18th, which is kind of pre-Russia invading Ukraine as well.
Yes.
So, how different the world is. And obviously, social media, even today with, China protests, Iran, the World Cup, Qatar, again, playing out on social media. It seemed quite timely to catch up with you as well. So what's the reaction been to the book in the last sort of 10 months?
That's been interesting. I mean, I think when there have been similar incidents of civil unrest, rioting, protesting to social media in Northern Ireland, obviously I do tend to get a little bit of interest in it. So I think generally there's a lot of discussion about mis and disinformation on social media. I think that's obviously since 2016 a key thread. And again, my research before that did find some evidence of it. But I mean, I think there's a lot of issues still playing out on social media, on online platforms in relation to the post-conflict inverted commas situation in Northern Ireland. I think there's a lot of anger and contention on these platforms, not just around protests and parades like I looked at, but also other issues like Brexit, for example. And a lot of discussion at the minute about the political stalemate where there's been no executive in Northern Ireland, no assembly running during one of the worst cost of living crisis we've ever experienced. So there's a lot of people who are quite angry, a lot of people using social media to express that anger, and a lot of issues that will still play out on platforms like Facebook, possibly Twitter, for however long it's going to be here on YouTube as well.
Just one of the things I wanted to ask you as well before we dive into it, when you're asked to do these various talks and stuff, you've done a lot of stuff on the radio, haven't you? And for various people, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, who's been coming to you for that. But do you get a steer from these people? Are they coming to you to comment about, do they say to you, can you comment on this, or can you comment on this part? I mean, do you find that they're trying to manipulate you as well about coming out as a researcher in support of an agenda they have, or is it more very, very general that they're looking for you to comment on?
There's a bit of a generic quality to it. I mean, the strange thing is, I mean, some of the things I've done in the past 12 months where the book has been the reason people have found me. So in some ways that's really good. Hopefully they're reading the book and buying it would be nice too. But I mean, one of the things that they always will ask is, how big a threat is this to, the peace process in Ireland? How, again, is this something that, is likely to cause unrest and tension? Is it going to exacerbate community relations or not? And there's a sort of almost like a standard question about that, I think. I mean, my sort of very academic answer, surprise, surprise, is on the one hand this, on the one hand that, and to say, well, yeah, there are obviously evidence of people being malevolent on platforms like that. There are also people who don't have such bad intentions, who very often get caught up in very heated debates on these sites, very often fighting their corner because, again, these platforms encourage people to do that. And I think it'd be very easy to just say all online platforms are negative. I mean, it is ultimately about how they're used. I don't think they're neutral by any means. And I do think there's certainly evidence that they have inflamed societal tensions across not just Northern Ireland or divided societies, but everywhere. I mean, let's be honest about it. But there are people who do use these platforms in more constructive ways. And I think we have to be wary of dismissing that. It's still important that perhaps people are there trying to offer an alternative viewpoint.
Now, just one of the points we touched on as well before we came on, isn't it, is the change in CEO, obviously, at Twitter. which then means that, with everybody having all their amnesties taken away and reintroduce their accounts, that obviously it could become even more of a hate-filled space void, if you like, than it was previously. And then you've got your sort of, the kind of the two different ends, isn't it? You've got Mastodon pitching itself as the sort of the anti-Twitter, and then you've got Trump with truth at the other end, which is saying, well, actually, even that's not free enough because I've been banned. Because does that pull the rug from under truth? That what you've really got is, again, we're back to the early days of social media almost, aren't we? Where you've still got brands now that are vying for people to use them. But we were talking about how, I mean, as sort of, the documentary media centre, we use Twitter in a particular way, but Citizens Eye, has got 3,000 plus followers on it. Well, that'll be really useful for our 10th anniversary in 2024 of that closing. What you don't really want to do is start again. So therefore, people will almost may stay because they've already got an audience. It's then how you use the audience yourself as a user, as opposed to what the platform represents.
I think there's an inertia. I think that's right. I mean, for very good reason. That, I mean, the number of very civic-minded individuals and groups who have built up social media followings that they can use to highlight things they're doing. I think there's an element where a lot of people I've seen, certainly in my online social networks, have not actually abandoned Twitter. They actually have, in many cases, changed their Twitter handle to show where they are on sites like Mastodon or Hive, but have kept Twitter in the background, which I think is interesting, because it says to me that some people probably want to see what's going to happen as a result of Elon Musk's takeover and the changes to moderation that we've seen, and don't want to lose that number of people, that network, which they have benefited from over the past year or 10 years in many cases they've been on it. So it's difficult. I mean, I think it is about, in an ideal world, we would build architectures on social media platforms which were not corporate or commercial, which were not funded by advertising, were not subject to algorithms which amplify, heated, angry content. But those platforms don't tend to work. Most people don't know what diaspora, which is one of the first, was. It's still there, I think. I mean, they don't really know what these platforms, non-commercial platforms, are, and don't generally tend to migrate all their networks onto it. For maybe the good reason is that you lose people. And again, Facebook's another example. We're 5 years on from Cambridge Analytica, 9 years on since Snowden. People are still using Facebook, not maybe the same number, but a lot of people are still there because their networks are there. So it's hard. And I do think there's an element where we need to perhaps think about subverting commercial platforms. Maybe the way to use the benefits of them, they talk about the affordances, the algorithms, the things which are helpful, is to turn that on its head and use that for more positive, socially good purposes.
I like that, because you were saying there about Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, Meta and all that sort of stuff. I remember people being quite strong about, I've deleted Facebook. Yeah, they've not said I'm going to amend how I use it. It's I'm going to delete Facebook. I'm deleting Mark Zuckerberg, as if like you are personally going to hurt him by removing your Facebook profile and all of your friends. Whereas over here on Twitter, it's very much around. I've seen quite a few tweets where it's about I'm amending, or almost like, reviewing how I use Twitter. And as you said, changing their bios to say, well, actually, I'm on other platforms. If you want it to be less contentious, you can follow me here as well. But I'm not going to disappear because I've built up a following. That's really interesting, isn't it?
Well, it's that sort of key question that, we use these platforms because we either like the attention and the feedback we get. And again, for some people, that is positive. For other people, it is negative. I mean, people do post inflammatory content online because they want a reaction. So if it's crudely called trolling, but maybe there are other ways. I mean, that's how some people have made careers. I mean, if you're a commentator, a political commentator, you're going to be on these sites because that's where your audience is. And there is an element where I think people idealistically will say, I won't give my money to, or I won't give my data to Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg. But when it comes push to shove, they are perhaps hedging their bets a bit. And perhaps they're not as idealistic about coming off these platforms as they might performatively be. I think you're right. A lot of people have done the tweets saying, I'm not going to be on this site anymore. A fair number that I see do the resignation tweet and then are still on it. I mean, they're not being discreet, because obviously you can see if they're retweeting content, or they'll come back to announce things the same way that they were before Elon Musk took over. So it's hard. My sort of sense on it is that if you're an activist, digital activist, or a social movement, or an NGO, or an advocacy group, it's very hard to replace what Twitter has given you for the past decade and a half. I mean, it's very hard to have a platform which could give you that amplification to that degree. And unfortunately, the amplification is the reason why it's got hate speech and disinformation and misinformation, all the negative sides of it too. So it is a bit more complicated than perhaps people think.
Yeah. And I guess LinkedIn still pushes itself very much as being business orientated, doesn't it? So therefore, it's not the natural successor or even bedfellow alongside your Twitter stream, because that really is a way, even if you post less, you're still able to observe what other people are doing. And I guess, coming back to our divided society, that the people that are your natural opposites, and social media kind of makes that easier for you to have an opinion about people or disagree with people and stuff like that. And like I said, this particular event, these flag protests that you spoke about back in those early days, where this was the place to do it, whereas now people are getting much more back into maybe direct action. You don't see like just stop the oil or Extinction Rebellion on social media per se. They're more out doing direct action. It's almost like they've made the decision that the virtual space is no longer the place to engage in conversation. Direct action is the way to go.
I think there's an element of that. I mean, I think I would qualify it and say that I imagine a lot of those activists like Just Stop Oil, who have, again, used physical protest, disruptive tactics, whether you agree or disagree with the tactic, it does get media attention. They're still probably using WhatsApp and other platforms which are not as public. So I think there's still an element where there's a digital aspect to it. But you're right to say it's probably not as traditional as we would have seen years ago, where it was, the YouTube video linking to the Facebook page, the Twitter account, and that's it. There's an effort here to up the ante to a degree. I mean, the example I'll give about back home, which again features many of the same personalities who were involved in the flag protests in 2012-13. So it feels very much like deja vu, is the social media pylons that were evident then, where you had people who were being named and shamed for saying things on social media platforms that they shouldn't, for threatening people, for being xenophobic, racist, or sectarian. That still is a pretty dominant thing. Now, I would argue that there's a case in the last week where Arlene Foster, formerly DUP leader, was at an awards event where a young woman took a video with her, and then went up the IRA in response, which Arlene Foster obviously recoiled at. Arlene Foster obviously has family background where her family were the victims of IRA atrocities back in the 1980s, and that circulated very quickly, that video. Then you have the Belfast Telegraph and news media picking up on it because the video was circulating quite freely. Journalists see it. Then you have the response, which is some of the loyalists who were involved in the flag protests, obviously outraged at this video, were effectively trying to dox the young woman in the video who had done this. And then you have on Sunday a newspaper article showing her with a AK-47 rifle, and again almost the media getting involved in this pylon against this woman who's had to step back from her job as a result of this scandal. So that's something I saw 2012. Still happening in 2022. And it doesn't just happen in divided societies. We see this a lot with public figures where pylons are quite common. And you do have to sort of question the motive of people, where if someone has made a mistake or done something in their background that they're probably not proud of, I'm not so sure it's the most constructive thing to do, to share it and effectively put some sort of target on their head online to say, this is the person who did that, attack their character. We may need to be more forgiving as a society, and maybe social media and the way in which it works doesn't allow us to, because we can be held accountable for things 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And we're not all politicians. I'd argue if we're private citizens, maybe we should forgive people who maybe don't know what they should or should not post on those sites when they are young. Maybe we should be a bit more forgiving.
Yes, I guess particularly as that generation now that was anywhere, I guess, between 10 and 14 now becomes, you know, 20 and 24, entering the marketplace, you know, post college or university or post education out in the real world. Suddenly, you know, hijinks and pranks and, you know, playing up to stereotypes. That's always going to be there, and you know, your generation and my generation, even, you know, I mean, that's a thing of the past. You know, we'd love to have a photograph of when we were at school, let alone
Yeah,
that was
or
actually
video.
not blurry. You know, yeah.
I mean, on that, I mean, there is some research which is talked about this and talks about, there's, on the one hand, people are resigned to the fact that what they're doing is owned by Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. So people are fully aware. They're not. 10 years ago, you might have said, some people thought, well, my data, my video, my post, my tweet, who'd really be interested in it? And they wouldn't have thought about, again, the platform owning that effectively, and them having signed away the rights to that content. Even if they delete it, it can live on via other people. You have that sort of evidence where people are effectively trading off the connectivity of these sites, the ability to self-promote, to amplify, because even though they know it's bad, it's still got some good things to it. And again, you have, on the other hand, this sort of this notion that young people are stereotyped as automatically reckless, that they're automatically almost naive to this when they're not. And it's very much a young person's mistake that they would tweet something which, you know, again, could be offensive to certain groups in society 10 years ago, and it wouldn't delete it. There's an element where we're only 10, 15 years into some of how these platforms work. I mean, that's relatively new. And I do think that you can talk about education. We can talk about educating people about what they should or should not say online. But, you know, these platforms are a publish then filter for a good reason. That's why we use them. We don't want someone to mediate what we say. We want to say and react in the moment. And that's inevitably going to mean that some things we say might be down the line something we would probably not have said if we thought. And that's kind of the hook of social media. And unfortunately, we're all perhaps to some extent dependent on that if you use online platforms.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you talk about education there. And now if you were to talk about that age group, you know, 10 to 14 that are now 20 to 24, we talk about education. I'd say that our experience of working in schools for the last 10 or 12 years has been very much that, you know, smart, you know, your phone's banned. You're not allowed to have it's banned. You're not online. I mean, I must admit during lockdown, doing some stuff with schools to be able to kind of dial into a classroom and be there, and the teachers be quite happy and head teachers be quite happy for you to be there talking to the classroom is a complete and utter, you know, 180 from where we were the day before lockdown. Well, of course, what you've got there really is the fact that even now when you go, and we did a mental health project where it was about the young people could use their smartphones and stuff, they weren't allowed to get them out during the session, but all of the content that was captured in the phones of This Is Me, their life that they brought in, all of the posters that were made and the things that got printed out were all things that they'd captured on their kind of like, you know, their smartphone. Well, of course, they're not phones now to our generation. They're not really phones. They're everything else. And it has the ability for you to speak to someone, but you don't even need to use the network now, O2 or Vodafone or EE or whoever. You can use WhatsApp or Messenger for audio. You don't need. And so schools have not really caught up with that change in technology, because really what you were saying there is, you know, it's only 10, 15 years ago. That's not even a generational change, is it? That's still quite up to date, a decade. It's not even a sort of 2 or 3 decade change yet. We're still in the early days of what could be with social media.
I think so. I mean, the attitude towards Wikipedia is the most interesting one to watch. Maybe I would say up until about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, most people who were doing, you know, the scholarship of learning and teaching, talking about learning and teaching in universities, would have probably frowned upon the notion that students should use Wikipedia full stop. I mean, certainly, again, you can draw a distinction between, you know, citing the Wikipedia page and actually looking at the source that Wikipedia links you to. And I think I'd still argue students should go to the original source, but there's a certain degree of, I think, permissibility about that now, where it's almost like every institution, I'd argue institutions always follow, I mean, the tech to a degree. sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And I think you can talk about digital technology, not just in education, but even in politics, where early efforts at it. I mean, I used to teach about Webb Cameron in 2010, David Cameron's efforts to humanize himself as leader of the opposition before he became prime minister, where it showed him cooking at home and stuff like that. And it got a lot of derision, but it was obviously an effort. You can question its sincerity or not, to depict him as more than just the person in suit behind a dispatch box. Institutions follow those things. Often they follow what citizens do on them. I mean, I think often you're right to say we have generations now who've grown up using these technologies from a very early age. I mean, social media platforms technically are 13 and above, but we know plenty of examples where kids are using smartphones younger than that. And not do them in ways that are automatically reckless. I mean, I come back to it. There's almost like a moral panic to say teenagers must be doing something untoward, nefarious, wrong, condemnable online, when in many cases I don't think they are. I think they're using it the way we do, which is to find connection, to find information, to follow things, news, things, current affairs, entertainment. We all have the same kind of need. We all use these platforms in similar ways. I just think there's often a generational divide which the media creates because it suits a headline. You know, reckless young person does something online is an age-old headline in most newspapers across the UK and further afield, when it probably isn't true.
Yeah, it's a well-known lazy headline to default to, isn't it? It's a bit like, you know, when you want to be positive, they're young adults or they're young people. As soon as you want to kind of demonize them, ironically, up to the age of 19, you call them teenagers, because it's almost the automatic assumption is a group of teenagers are up to no good, but a group of young people, you know, a group of young adults or whatever, you know,
youths is always the
youths. Well, that's probably the
something.
worst. And if they're a group of youths, then it's automatically they were hooded up and balaclavaed, like, you know. Okay, so I want to just look at this, your two books now. There we go. So it's two books in our archive, my friend. Yeah. So this one here, Framing the Troubles Online, from 2010, and obviously your digital contention in a divided society. Now, I want to talk about the future. Okay, so let's imagine now we're, I don't know, 50 years in the future, and of course I'll give you an example here. It says this one here. It says, can the internet really make a difference? Okay, so like, you know, can the wheel really make a difference? Okay, this first book, 10 years later, yeah, this book says, Digital Contention of Divided Society explores how social media. So it's like, you know, we invented the wheel, and here's the train. You know what I mean? So it's all going to be about how it's framed, but also who wins. Who's going to win? Are there winners in using social media? Is it going to be us as people that use those as consumers and or activists? I guess, you know, let's go for the activism angle this 16 days. Or is it going to be ultimately the winner is going to be the person that has invented the technology? So obviously we've got the person who invented the wheel, or have we got the person that invented the train and mass transportation and stuff like that?
Oh, it's a good question. I mean, for me, sadly, maybe Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, I mean, they didn't create, well, Zuckerberg obviously did create Facebook. That's not maybe accurate. Elon Musk didn't create Twitter, but certainly the way he's running it, I would be controversial or an overstatement to say that he doesn't understand what he bought. He doesn't really understand things like how bots work. He doesn't understand free speech, again, often bandied around by these platform owners, you know, that they're doing everything, they're champions of free speech when they're really not. I mean, again, in many cases, these platforms are bastions of hate speech and things which are not free speech. They're certainly not civil. I think I would be optimistic that if people act in a concerted, organized way, they have more power over these platforms than they think. I think there is, I mean, these platforms, if people decide not to use them in large numbers, won't continue indefinitely. I mean, with Twitter, the loss of advertising in the past couple of weeks, it is a serious issue. I mean, there's no doubt that the approach being taken by Elon Musk has had a negative impact on the sustainability of Twitter as an infrastructure, as a company, maybe all of the above. People have more power collectively. The trouble is, and I think this is not just an online problem, it's an offline problem as well. people are very atomized, very fractured in the minute. I mean, globally, there are a lot of very, competing crises at the minute, which means that there's not really a sort of popular movement against commercial online platforms, because people are already dealing with COVID, with Russia, Ukraine, with cost of living issues. I mean, people are divided by default. So it goes back to our starting point about divided societies. If people were less divided, then yes, there's a strong chance that some of these tools could be reformed. There is a lot of work out there about, could there be a public internet where some of the issues around commercial platforms would be removed. I mean, Christian Fuchs, really good author, has written about this, and I think there's merits in exploring how you establish a non-commercial alternative, but how you build it. And I think the only way you build it is to have people involved at the start, not technologists who are quite removed in Silicon Valley deciding to do it, which of course is why we're ending up where we are. And Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg, have made a lot of money out of this. They have certainly espoused values about democracy, about civil society. You'd argue that Jack Dorsey selling Twitter to Elon Musk makes a mockery of that. You'd argue that Mark Zuckerberg's admission in front of those committee hearings in the US about how Facebook doesn't really do what it says it does about disinformation or hate speech, their poor record in these things shows that they're not really ultimately about improving society. They're about money, about commerce. And I do wonder, is there a possibility to build something better? Or do we, as I've seen other people say, and you remember this, John, from back in the early days of Citizens Eye, are we going to go back to the idea that the blogosphere, websites, the things I studied in that book from 2010, 2011, had less of these issues? Now, they weren't going to get the same number of people visiting them, but that there was an element of control about what you wanted to say. It was longer, sometimes more considered. Maybe that's the way the next version of the web should be. It should be people writing things more thoughtfully, in long form. Yeah. Maybe people reading them like that. I kind of wonder, again, tweets, toots on Mastodon, we're tuned now to look at things which are quick to respond.
Bite size, yeah, bite size.
And is that necessarily conducive for people being kinder to one another? I'm not so sure. I kind of think you maybe have to look at this in a different way. What do we want from these platforms? And what do we want from being online? So there's a lot of things we could do. I mean, maybe we should be more optimistic than people are at the minute.
Yeah. I mean, coming at it from a purely commercial aspect as well. I mean, there's, I'll float an idea with you now that, Elon Musk, probably one of the cleverest people on the planet, if you watch the documentaries and believe about all these kind of space stuff and all this, Tesla and PayPal. Let's not forget he did kind of come up with that. That in fact, what he's doing here is allowing back the true audience that should be on Twitter, which is angry people. I'll use that very kind of inverted commas, angry people, and almost like asset stripping in the good old days of corporate raiding and taking out whatever values there, whatever that value is, or maybe in fact it's always been overvalued, so it never really was worth that. It was just a punt. To then actually make that the home of hate, in order for the home for more inclusive, more engaging, more civic society orientated platform to come along, because it was being stifled, a bit like a jungle. The strongest tree will always grow, whereas in fact these things were always there. So your mastodons and all of these other ones that seem to be much more cohesive and community orientated and civil society orientated were almost like what Web 1.0 was. Are we doing that? I mean, am I kind of giving him far too much credence there, that he's going to go where the money is, which is in the hate?
Probably. I mean, if this video disappears, you'll know that he's watching what we do. Yeah. My sort of sense is that I don't think Elon Musk wanted to buy Twitter. I think the way he tried to get out of it legally after this bid was accepted makes me think that there's an element of Trump in this too. It's people with a lot of power, a lot of wealth, who know the value of a news story, and saying you're going to do something. I mean, arguably, there is a parallel with Trump in that there's a lot of people who do think that Trump was running for president in 2016, not to win, but to launch his TV network. And then he won. So it was left with the problem. Perhaps he didn't anticipate.
You're hearing about that.
I wonder with Musk, I mean, Twitter wasn't making an awful lot of money before he took over. He clearly did not anticipate having to take over. I think his decision-making in terms of what he's done with staff layoffs and firings would suggest to me it doesn't feel very much that there's a plan there. And I sort of wonder, they often will use the rhetoric that's there about democracy, free speech, civil liberties. People who are in such positions always say that they want to make things better. But if you judge them by their deeds, they rarely do. And a different question is, what should a multi-billionaire have such control over what for many people is seen as a public platform? Should they be able to, as Elon Musk has done recently, put a poll out which says, should I bring back Trump or not? Yes or no, binary choice, in full knowledge that bots and that can be manipulated, and it shouldn't really be the way you decide moderation based on straw polls. Should someone have that power over what for many people has been a very valuable public communication tool and platform over the past 12 years? I'd say no. But money talks. Elon Musk had the money to buy it. Very few other people would have had the money to buy it. And you're not going to have governments launching their own versions of Twitter and Facebook because they couldn't afford to run it either. So, what do you do? How do you fund something in a way which is not going to have that problem? I don't think that's a simple thing to arrive at. Maybe that's where you need to have platforms which are crowdfunded, which are very small. Maybe Mastodon servers is a good starting point for that, because people there feel that there's better patrolling around community standards. There's clearly a vetting process to join a server. That's small. If Mastodon got the size of Twitter, it would probably go the same way. That it would be using algorithms, AI to make decisions which humans used to make. So it's tricky. You can't scale up socially responsible platforms unless you have a lot of people and a lot of influence amongst those people.
And that kind of concept of getting the genie back into the bottle, which most people, the horse is bolted, what's the point in locking the gate? And you're never going to get the genie back in the bottle. Are we going to see, do you think, over, say, the next 5 to 10 years, more kind of EU regulations when it comes to, if you want to operate on our shores, you have to have this kind of way of operating? Do you think they're going to be able to, do you think it's someone like the EU that's able to push back against Silicon Valley? Because Silicon Valley being in the States means almost like, the house, the two houses are unable to do that, because it's almost like they're too in bed with it. So therefore it's got to be someone else that can do that.
Well, the Digital Services Act, which the EU have passed, does offer that kind of, teeth, for want of a better word, for platforms to be more tightly regulated, also to be held accountable for the quick removal and identification of hate speech, of dis and misinformation. Again, question marks about whether that might prompt a different problem. I mean, a bit of research I did this year actually found that in response to demanding that Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube remove stuff within 24, 48 hours, as some countries do legislate for, you have a situation where it goes the other way, where platforms block anything which is remotely controversial and end up blocking things which shouldn't be blocked. So it almost works both ways. The EU have arguably the leading role to play in this, because the DSA has been passed. Again, they want to hold platforms accountable in ways they've not been before. The question is, of course, I mean, there's already been people saying about Musk that what he proposes with moderation would violate all of this DSA, all of the EU legislation that exists, all of the EU codes of conduct. He's in violation of it. So that would mean technically fines. Again, if you're fining a company that size and an owner who has bottomless pockets, is that really going to change how those platforms work? I don't know. I still think that those platforms survive in some form until people pull the plug, as in people who use them decide we're not going to do this anymore and literally remove everything and come off it, not put up posts which say, I'm migrating to Mastodon or Hive, but I'll still be here occasionally. That's not going to really make an effort.
Yeah.
And if you did that, you might arguably pushed people like Elon Musk more towards the things that were good about Twitter's moderation, that it had people who were reviewing things, that it was trying to take this more seriously, that it wasn't trying to offshore it to technology or to AI or tools that might not do a good job. But it's a big gap.
Yeah, sometimes I think what we're talking about there will come as a consequence of everybody pulling in a different direction. So say, for example, there's a pull towards online child abuse, for example, as in legislating against that, taking down quicker abuse that's identified and all that sort of stuff. Then the other stuff becomes a consequence of putting in a robust response to obviously something like, a clear and present danger, like, a public health thing, as opposed to other. And I thought that maybe COVID would have some kind of impact like that as well, around public health messaging and stuff. And I'm still not sure, Mike. I'm out on that one with my own judgment. But I always felt that legislating for one particular thing would almost capture the other thing without doing it, because that was more contentious. You start talking democracy to people and free speech, then it means different things to you and I than to Americans if we had them on here now. It's a very kind of enshrined, and to us it's like kind of logical. Why would you want to say that to someone?
Well, the fact they're all Silicon Valley companies is no coincidence, because obviously First Amendment, the US legislative environment lends itself to having platforms which are not regulating speech or content before it goes out. And again, it comes back to that. The key way to regulate online platforms is to destroy their central DNA, which is that you can post anything you want, which will only be challenged or removed after the event. So somebody has to report that to Facebook and Twitter, and then it's removed by them, or it's done retrospectively by the platform. The only way to clean it up would be to say, we're going to review every post that someone wants to make. So when you use your phone to tweet something this morning, that there's a delay in that. Now, how you would resource that when these platforms have millions of users worldwide and geographically based across the world is very difficult to do. So there is no kind of easy solution to clean it up. I come back to that sort of central point, that if you want to clean up the social web, or you're going to call it online platforms, you have to probably look at how these platforms operate. And that's something that a lot of people, whether they're citizens, users, or the owners of those platforms themselves, don't want to do, but might be forced to do if people were to make this more of an issue.
Now, I just want to finish off on an example, a more specific example, I guess, as well. I mean, both of us have taught for many years now, you much longer than I, students, international students, particularly those from China. And obviously at the moment you've got we're not really going to talk about Iran and Qatar, because they're two specific examples. But I mean, I'm picking the China one simply because the sort of in-house in China social media is bigger than any of the many platforms that you and I have already mentioned. So it kind of is quite interesting, really. We're talking about these, but we're not actually talking about amounts of users. And I remember I've taught not as many international or Chinese students as you have, but certainly the ones that I've engaged in conversation whose parents were like, doctors and, teachers or members of the party and stuff like that. They were very open and free talking to me as an individual, out of earshot of everybody else, and certainly would never engage in that level of conversation within a workshop or a lecture space and stuff like that. So you could get personal comments out of them and thoughts and what they thought, both pro and sort of anti the way things operate. But it was interesting because one of those students yesterday posted a screenshot of someone else's kind of, that can only be described as, anti-government and what the government's doing to sort of lockdown protests and stuff like that after the tower block fire. And I was like, wow. And what surprised me was not what they'd posted, but the fact that it was them that had posted it. Because it was like, that's almost like a out in the public sphere that you've made that statement. It's really interesting, particularly knowing what their parents do. And I'm not going to go into any details, obviously, for obvious reasons, but is it something that you've picked up? I mean, you've taught today, you know what I mean? You've been teaching the last week or so. It's there, the whole kind of zero COVID policy and stuff. It's not so much the policy as such, it's the fact, the controlling of the space, the digital space, the online social media space, to cut down on videos of protests or things being said. And of course, you've then got that kind of situation in Iran as well. I'm thinking of people running up and knocking things off people's heads and stuff like that. You know, it's kind of playing out at the moment, isn't it? It's not just now Trump and Twitter and you know, Elon Musk. Now we're actually talking about hardcore life and death stuff in countries where you normally think everything's controlled, and social media is seen as a way of, probably the only way of expressing either this has been going on for a long time, or this is how I feel and I want, you know, change.
I suppose there's good. I mean, there's positive and negatives to this. It shows that you cannot, even if you try, censor everything online, that things can always get out. I mean, I was doing some really interesting reading about Palestinian video activism and about some of the NGOs who work there, and some of the extremes they almost have to go to, knowing that there is, you know, quite stringent censorship of digital spaces. You know, obviously they can cut off the internet to, you know, parts of the Gaza Strip to stop people uploading content which might be showing Israeli troops in a negative light. And one of the things that they were doing, believe it or not, and this will be relevant to you, John, too, is they were using VHS tapes to smuggle content. So they almost were going back to old media, inverted commas, because it'd be harder for the states, you know, that they were trying to obviously expose on some of the behaviors of elites, perhaps, to stop that. So they were smuggling videos, almost like, you know, we're talking here almost East Berlin, West Berlin in the late 1980s. And I think that just shows that if there's, again, people who witness things, who are able to record it using whatever technology they have, which can be discreet or perhaps old school like that, will always find a way to get it out. Whether or not it changes things is probably my question, because it's a bit like going back to our discussion of Facebook earlier on. You know, we think Twitter's, you know, RIP, that, you know, Musk has killed it. We thought Facebook would be killed off by, you know, the Snowden revelations. It wasn't. And I think we look at the so-called Arab Spring, we're talking about decades and anniversaries. You know, we're 11 years on. Many of the places, like in Egypt, where, you know, we saw a lot of video activism, a lot of people sharing content which showed how brutal these regimes were, did not become, you know, freedom-loving democracies. They did not, in many cases, change the form of government. They changed the person, but they didn't change the way they were governed at all. It did not lead to people having more rights. And we have to be wary of overstating the impact of this, I think, because it probably takes a bit more than exposing something that we probably already know. I think most of us would already have an idea that China will brutally put down protests in certain cities. And COVID, there were protests before. It's not news, but for it to change how things work, we need to probably look at it in terms of what political pressure could you place on China internationally using that content. And that's where I keep thinking back to my first example of digital activism. You know, the Zapatista Net War, 1994, used news groups, you know, and Usenet was what they used for that. It was only when government started paying attention to the activism that things maybe were a bit harder for the government, the Mexican government in that case, to deny or to dismiss that as a threat. You don't reform governments through citizens just recording things. There has to be more to it. So I don't know. I like to be more optimistic, but my impression is that Iran had a 2009 Twitter revolution. We're in 2022, and it feels very much this is the same kind of thing. And I don't think that what happened then really changed things for people on the ground in the way we might have hoped, looking on from over here.
Interesting. Well, like I said, mate, from the conversation we had 10 months ago when you launched the book back in January, obviously, you know, the conflict in Ukraine and various issues and the Qatar World Cup, and, you know, social media has become even more of a playground, battleground for those things to kind of play out, if you like, in the kind of digital space and to people as well. What would you do if you were to update this book now, 10 months later? What would you do?
I am updating this book right now, so thanks for the question.
There you go. That was a perfect segue then, wasn't it?
There will be a paperback version out next year. I think what I have done is looked at April 2021 and the so-called Brexit riots, and again, very similar themes. I mean, Just looking at Twitter, how it was used at that time, mainly by people over in Great Britain, looking in at what was happening around the rioting and unrest that was nominally linked to the Northern Ireland Protocol and to Brexit, but also was a lightning rod for other issues with the peace process, with perceptions of policing being biased against loyalists and activists like that in particular. And it's maybe a little bit depressing that the same themes come up. You have, to a degree, people who are bystanders, are not directly involved, who maybe don't have any direct stake in this, who are using situations that they're detached from geographically and perhaps emotionally to further their own objectives. So a lot of people who tweeted using that hashtag didn't really seem to know much about what was the context of that violence, didn't know really much about what had happened post 1998 agreement. But we're obviously wanting to use it to kick what the then Boris Johnson government about the Brexit deal he'd negotiated, the oven-ready one. So you still have a culture of a blame game. You still have people, I think, using online platforms to point fingers, to shirk responsibility or blame, to get things off their chest. I mean, it's about venting. I mean, for a lot of us, how we use social media, there's an element where, whether it's us doing the tweets or us following it, we do take some satisfaction, perhaps, if people have the same view as us, whether that's a positive or negative one. And I think there's still that element where it's not really going to change or transform how, in a divided society, in a post-conflict inverted commas society, people get to know each other. I mean, arguably, it's never really been about that. It's been more about people following news and emoting rather than about communicating to one another. And I'd like to see more dialogue. Maybe online platforms should have a better role to play in terms of creating space for people to talk to one another. Kind of like this, to actually have conversations about things which are more meaningful than just short, quick responses to something which is designed to anger or to get an extreme reaction from.
Yeah, it was interesting. The conversation I recorded last week and put out yesterday for day 3 was an interview like this with Delta, who's a trans trainee journalist that's involved in the Dot Media Centre here. And what really came out of that is, if you've never met anyone who's trans or anything about trans issues, you've either got J.K. Rowling as your person, and it is what she said actually what she meant, and then you've got Dave Chappelle with his sort of comedic take on the whole thing. Whereas in fact, the ability to go out and actually engage in a conversation, most people think, well, I don't want to go and talk to you in case I make a mistake. We tried to get to the bottom of what was an ally. Well, it was someone who was just willing to make a mistake by asking and educating themselves about, what those issues were for that particular community. And we could say that a lot, whether it was, disability, racism, Me Too, or any of those, ageism, enable any of those things really is very much around, you've got to put yourself outside your comfort zone in order to learn something, and there's going to be a willingness to learn. And of course, social media will give you your news in a way that it kind of fits what your political agenda or your own narrative or bias already, rather than actually educating you with alternative viewpoints.
Well, it's performative allyship. I'm sure, again, Delta was talking about this too, that you have people who'll use the hashtag, it used to be Twibbins and changing your profile picture to certain colors. There are people who will only do that because it's a trend. But I would argue, and I'm sure many others would, in all sorts of activism and all sorts of movements, that's not enough. I mean, I get one of my students this year made a really great point, and again, it was about I think it's a trans activist called Monica Roberts, and Monica Roberts had this view, which was very much, you have to show up. Very simple way of framing it, but again, it speaks to the limitations of how we use platforms. I think that it's all well and good to use the hashtag to say I stand with or I stand against, but are those people actually standing? I'd argue they're on their phones.
Yeah,
when they're on the commutes, they're taking a minute from their day. They're not really going to change that situation at all. That's one step. The next step is obviously, as you just said, which is that, well, how am I going to learn more about it? How am I actually going to not, if not walk a day in the shoes of someone who is again trans, or we talk about BLM, how am I actually going to not just recognize that but also address it? And I think that's harder, doing the hard work.
Yeah,
it's hard.
yeah. As I said about the engaged public part of my model, isn't it? It's always that kind of move beyond the like button on Facebook. I like that. I'm outraged. I like that. I've sent it to you because I know you'll be outraged too.
Yeah, because you agree with me. And again, it's almost that kind of reinforcement. We share things with each other online because we assume the other person shares our view. And then that doesn't change their mind, doesn't change our mind, and doesn't really address the root cause of social injustice, which is usually what many of these things are around. So you're right, it's taking the heat out of it and making something more slow, in-depth, long form. I mean, if my ideal internet would be that. It would probably be a very boring place compared to what it is now, but it would be certainly more civil and perhaps more constructive.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the trouble, as you said, it's become almost like a way of entertaining people, because as someone who's a political commentator, people are following you, expecting you to be who you are. So you're almost like feeding that personality, really, as opposed to moving the agenda forward. What you're doing is you're entrenching people in their own viewpoint, because they've come to you as a commentator for that kind of anger or viewpoint. Interesting. Listen, my friend, very good to speak to you. Thank you very much. When are we expecting the paperback version of Digital Contention?
Hopefully next summer. So yes,
next summer.
Keep tuned. I'm sure the DMC will promote. Yeah, so I will share.
I'm sure we will. We'll be on point for that. And will it be an additional chapter to bring everything up to date, or are you? How does it work? Are you reviewing all of the content throughout the book, or does it change as in a bigger forward and then a chapter? How does it work?
There'll be an epilogue and a prologue, most likely. So there'll be a few amendments to it. But yeah, I mean, the main substantive chapters will be the same, but there'll be more content added to it. So yeah, a lot to do, but we'll get there.
Brilliant. You take care, Paul. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John.